Thank you all for joining us today to talk about the agency public access policies focused on publications, as was mentioned, and these are specifically the policies that are currently in effect. As was mentioned, we had the previous NIH overview. So if you had a chance to join, this information on this slide will not be new. But as we're walking through the other agency policies, I'm going to kind of compare them to NIH's policy, since I think that's probably the one that's most well known. So I did want to give a very kind of brief overview on NIH's public access policy. And in terms of the scope of the policy, it's focused on NIH-funded author-accepted manuscripts, and specifically those that are accepted for publication on or after July 1st. In the FAQs, NIH did specify that it is specifically for those publications coming out of awards that are currently open. If the award had previously been closed, it would fall under the previous policy. In terms of the submission timeline, authors are expected to submit the publications upon acceptance, and then NIH will make those available without embargo on the official date of publication. NIH does offer kind of two pathways for complying with this. The first is for the authors to submit the accepted manuscript to PMC upon acceptance. The other is when NIH has agreements with journals and publishers to provide the articles themselves. And so in that case, NIH will make those articles available on the official date of publication. NIH's policy does also state that noncompliance may be considered in future funding decisions. So looking at other agencies that do have policies in effect, most of these policies went into effect at the end of the last administration, and some of them were kind of a bit more quietly put into place and just really kind of worked into normal agencies' workflows. Put into notice of funding opportunities, put into, reporting requirements, but did want to kind of mention each one that is currently in effect. The first is for NASA's Science Mission Directorate. NASA Science Mission Directorate, my understanding, already kind of had this policy in development when the memo did come out, and it was in alignment with the expectations of the memo. And it went into effect December of 2022. So NASA as a whole does not have a policy in place, but I will note that NASA's Science Mission Directorate funds about 70% of all of the extramural funding that NASA does provide. And so if you do have NASA funding, there's a very high chance that you would fall under this policy. The next is the CDC. Their policy went into effective April last year. Department of Education's policy went into effect for the entire agency September 30th of last year. Department of Education's Institute of Educational Sciences did have a policy in place, but Department of Education did update their regulations to have the policy effective for the entire agency. Department of Energy's policy for publications went into effect at the beginning of the fiscal year on October 1st. AHRQ's was effective in December of last year, and then EPA's became effective at the beginning of this calendar year in January. So I wanted to kind of walk through some of those different areas to compare them with the NIH policy and to kind of share what the agency expectations are for those policies that are in effect. And so in terms of kind of the scope of the agency policies, it is consistent across the board. So the expectation, the scope of this is for peer-reviewed scholarly publications that are funded by the agency. The timeline for submission is also fairly consistent, with most agencies saying in their policy that accepted manuscripts do need to be submitted upon acceptance. And this is actually pretty consistent that with the policies that were in place previously when there was an embargo. In most cases, the expectation was to submit upon acceptance, but because there was that embargo, there was a bit more leeway. Moving down to zero embargo, that expectation becomes much more important to be able to release on the publication date. The one difference here is EPA. EPA's policy says that you need to submit the accepted manuscript within 30 days of publication. In terms of when agencies will make publications available, they will do it on the publication date without embargo, as soon as they're submitted to the agency. In terms of kind of options for complying, we talked about the two NIH compliance options. The first is the author submitting the accepted manuscript. The second is the agreements that NIH has with publishers to submit those to the agency. And so there are a couple other agencies that are using NIH's platform, AHRQ and EPA, and they do have those two compliance options. NASA has their own submission and discovery platforms, but they are also kind of trying to work with publishers through their course agreement. The other agencies, CDC, Department of Education, and DOE, all have the expectation that the author is the one who needs to submit the accepted manuscript in all cases. So, the agencies are really kind of generally encouraging green OA with deposit into the agency repositories, but there are two agencies within their policies that do encourage OA publishing. That's Department of Education and NASA SMD. There is no requirements included about publishing OA. There's no requirements about specific licenses that need to be attached, but it is kind of encouraged in the policies. In terms of allowable costs, across all of the agencies, they talk about reasonable publication costs being allowable, and so that's consistent with what was in the NIH's policy. NIH is the only agency that provided that additional guidance about repository deposit or submission fees not being allowable. So that's something that we'll need to watch to see if other agencies provide any guidance that might be consistent with NIH. But so far, I've only seen that out of the NIH's policy. Of course, NIH did announce that they are planning to have a cap on allowable publication costs, and they did put out a request for information on this topic. They list out a few options that they're considering, and responses for that are due September 15th. And within that RFI, NIH says that this will go into effect in January of 2026. For compliance, many of the agencies do say that they may consider this in future funding decisions and applications. There were a couple agencies that CDC, I couldn't find specific guidance that kind of talked about that. And then NASA Science Mission Directorate talked about having more kind of community consultation on future funding decisions. I did want to provide some kind of quick links to the agency's submission platforms and the designated repositories where you can find the information, these accepted manuscripts and journal articles. So there are a handful of agencies that are working with NIH and using their platform for submission, and then PubMed Central for discovery. So AHRQ, CDC, and EPA. CDC also has their own platform, CDC Stacks, and so the CDC journal articles and accepted manuscripts will be found in both PubMed Central and CDC Stacks. For the other agencies, DOE, Department of Education, and NASA, they have their own platforms that they're using. I did want to mention science.gov here. Science.gov does have functionality that allows you to search across all of the agency designated repositories so that you wouldn't have to kind of go to them one by one to search. You could do that using science.gov. I did want to hit on other agencies that don't yet have policies effective. So the memo does say that agencies are to have their policies effective by the end of this calendar year, so by December 31st. There are some agencies that have released their policies, but they haven't gone into effect quite yet. But within those policies, it does state when they'll become effective. And so for NEH, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and ILLS, Institute of Museum and Library Services, those will both become effective October 1st. And then there are a number of agencies that are will be kind of waiting till the end of the calendar year. So the Administration for Community Living, Administration for Children and Families, Census Bureau, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, and FDA. I would expect all of the other agencies not listed to be in compliance by that December 31st date, but of course we'll be watching for that. I did want to mention two other agencies specifically, just because we've kind of heard what we might expect coming. So NSF, we expect their policy to be a part of the PAPG, which is the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide. And so we expect that the kind of requirements laid out in their public access plan will be reflected in that guide. We had expected it earlier this year, but now have heard that that may be released in September. Typically, the PAPG doesn't always kind of go immediately into effect. I believe there's typically some time before the effective date, but we have heard that it could be effective. If it comes out in September, it could be effective as early as October 1st, which is the beginning of the fiscal year. And then NOAA kind of has a slightly different process where they have been developing their policy all along the way, but it's been, I think, caught up in kind of the administration change and waiting for a new NOAA administrator to be approved. And so our understanding is that that policy may be released in the near term, and once it is released, it will go into effect immediately. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dave.
Thanks, Carly. So I am going to talk a little bit about both the legal mechanism that the agencies are using in order to make articles publicly available, as well as some of the publisher responses that we've seen so far to the implementation of some of these policies. So first, and this is really short, if you've like been on our webinars before or been paying attention to stuff that Authors Alliance puts out, you know, we have a lot of stuff on like what is this federal purpose or government use license? What is the scope of it? How does it work? I put a link into the chat for a couple of the white papers that we've written that really dig into the details if you want to get nerdy about this. But I wanted to highlight here just a couple of things. One is that if you read the actual regulation, it talks about a license for the government to make uses consistent with a federal purpose. And so I often use the term federal purpose, but there's actually a long history behind this license. It goes way back about 50 years to the 1970s. And earlier versions of this license talked about government use. And so in a lot of places, you'll see both of these terms used. So I just wanted to flag that as an initial matter. Sometimes that can be a little confusing. It today, I don't think makes a huge difference because basically every agency is operating under the same license. It's just kind of a different terminology. So where this license comes from is actually not the granting agencies at all, but it comes from, you'll see it cited here on the page, 2 CFR 200.315. That's a regulation, or not a regulation. It's a set of uniform guidance that the Office of Management and Budget puts out to try to make sure that when granting agencies are giving out funds, that they do so in a relatively consistent way so that, you know, when you're a university and you're getting a grant from, say, the Department of Energy, and then you're also getting a grant from the NIH, you're not playing by totally different rules across those agencies. And so as part of this uniform guidance, OMB promulgates this text that then the different agencies adopt. And that's the other thing that I wanted to flag for those of you who are like deep down in the details here. You'll notice that sometimes when people talk about the federal purpose license or the government use license, you'll find a different citation to where that license is located. So the NIH, interestingly, cites to 2 CFR 200.315, which is kind of funny to me because the actual reg that applies to NIH and HHS is located in a different place, but it's the exact same text, so it kind of doesn't matter. And AHRQ actually does cite to the applicable regulation there, 45 CFR 75.322. So I won't belabor this. I just wanted to flag there. These are areas where I have received questions and people are like clearly trying to piece these puzzle pieces together, and it's not always obvious. And so these are some of the reasons why it's not always obvious. Um, but the main point here is that the agencies are, in general, relying on the federal purpose license. Several of them have specifically relied on it, and that's what we have up here on the page. Not all agencies have done that, though, in their public access policies. Some of these others have simply explained the policy without necessarily getting into the legal backing of the license for that. That doesn't mean that they don't have the right to do it. If you read your grant agreements very carefully, they will usually incorporate by reference, the entirety of the applicable federal regulations that govern use of grant dollars for that agency, including that agency's version of the federal purpose license. So even if you don't see it in the agency policy, it's still kind of back behind there. So that's what I wanted to say on the federal purpose / government use license. So let's get into some responses from publishers. Next slide, please. And I will say that a lot of the recent action here has happened in response to the NIH acceleration of the NIH policy, even though other agencies have been kind of plodding along and putting their policies into place. So one of the questions is, do we have any examples of publishers, particularly ACS and Springer Nature? They've been very visible on these issues. Do we have any examples of people basically not paying those journals what they are asking for, but publishing anyways, and then kind of going ahead and trying to comply with their federal agency requirements? So I'm not aware of anyone kind of poking the bear in this way so far. And I'm also not aware, though, of any of these publishers taking any overt or public action against anyone who may have done this. My suspicion, just based on the sheer number of articles that are published and also my experience working with authors, some of whom are very attentive to their publishing agreements and some of whom are frankly not, that there are some mistakes that have probably happened already. But as far as I'm aware, like there has not been any real enforcement from publishers going after anybody, certainly nothing public. The one thing that has happened, though, ACS, many of you are probably aware that ACS had implemented a scheme where if you wanted to or had to comply with a public access policy, and didn't want to pay their full open access fee, gold open access fee, they kind of concocted this green OA article development charge. And that had been in place for a while. Following the implementation of the NIH public access policy, ACS basically paused that article development charge. I believe they said for July and August. It's now August 5th, so we will see whether they extend that or what ACS does next. But that's basically it. The publishers have done a lot to change their guidance pages and information on their websites, but I have not yet seen any action from publishers. Certainly not action against authors who may have slipped up and accidentally not complied with what their publishing agreement said. Next slide, please. Have publishers change their workflows? So yeah, definitely. As I mentioned, they've updated their guidance on their websites. I think the main thing is if you're publishing in a subscription journal, no longer expect your publisher to deposit directly to PubMed Central. So that's the big one. Um, and it remains a little unclear whether or how publishers will be routing papers based on funder acknowledgments. Um, it seems like a pretty obvious thing for them to do, that if you acknowledge that you have NIH funding and their policy is that you cannot deposit a paper immediately under a normal subscription route, that they would push you towards the gold open access option. Um, but I haven't heard of that actually making its way into their technical workflow yet. So that's something to be on the lookout for. And actually, this is a place where I think we'd really love to hear from you. Uh, Authors Alliance actually has a survey up on our site. Not really a survey, but just a place for people to share information with us about their experience with implementation of the public access policies. So I'll put the link here. And as you, as authors or as librarians who are supporting authors with some of their deposit requirements, if you encounter issues like this where people are getting automatically routed, that would be really helpful for us to know, so we can kind of share that information with other people and help them just understand what this process is going to look like as we feel this out. All right, next slide. Um, for policies like NIHs that have already rolled out, are any publishers agreeing to continue author-accepted manuscript on behalf of authors without an embargo? Yeah, actually, there are some really large publishers that are signaling they're going to stop, but there are other large publishers that have indicated that uh, they are A-okay with this kind of policy. Um, and you know, I do think that what this means for authors is that pre-submission, there's a little bit more research required to just understand how your publisher is going to react here. There's also a question about allowable costs that Carly already got into. And one of the really, really interesting, juicy bits here. Um, Actually, this is on the next slide, so we can go to it. Um, is One of the juicy bits here is like, what about these other fees that publishers are kind of putting in place? ACS has this article development charge. Is that an allowable cost? If you go to our FAQ update page, we get into that a little bit. You know, on the face of NIH's policy, it really seems like the ACS charge should not be allowable. Um, I haven't seen anything published from the NIH saying that specifically. I see there's a comment in the chat with someone um, indicating that maybe those costs will not be allowable, but that's kind of an interesting issue. Um, I just want to make sure I'm not losing my um, what slide are we on here? Um, we're down
Slide
here.
12. Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. I was just trying to make sure I'm on my right set of slides. Um, so will there be any expectation that the work be published in an open access format as opposed to archives in an OA repository? Most agencies are really pushing hard the green OA author accepted manuscript route. Certainly, if you go the gold route, you know that's a pathway, and there are all sorts of costs associated with that. But the uh, the route but that still would require for those agencies deposit. Um, uh, and there are a handful of agencies noted here where we've got a kind of other version of that, but that's sort of the exception to the rule, really. Um, and this last one, next slide, please. I was telling Nick and Carly before we started, like, I don't know that I want to write something down here because this is a hard question of what happens if the author doesn't pay an APC or whatever other fee the publisher has come up with to allow for immediate green OA deposit. Um, but, you've got an agency that says that under their public access policy, you've got to make this thing publicly available. So that's a tough situation. And I think increasingly we're going to see authors caught there where, especially when they've already submitted an article, they've waited, 2, 3, 6 months to hear that their article has been accepted. And now they're faced with this problem of they either pony up a bunch of money to this journal who's saying, if you want us to publish it, you've got to pay right now. Or you go through that whole submission process with some other journal that's going to be compliant with the public access policy. So I think it's really important to think about the different risks associated with these pathways here. I think we don't know exactly what enforcement is going to look like um, at the agency level, but I guess one thing I've observed is the NIH sure seems keen on their policy. Uh, and I don't think they're going to come down with like a super heavy hand, but I think they're going to be paying a lot of attention to compliance. Um, and so, I guess one way to think about this is what are the relative risks related to ongoing grant funding and compliance on that side of the ledger versus, um, you know, uh, ongoing relationships with particular publishers. Um, all right. Implementation FAQs. That's kind of the next issue that I started to bleed into. And Carly, maybe you want to jump in here. Um, like I said, I think certainly agencies are going to be paying attention here historically as these policies have rolled out. Going back to the NIH's in 2008, that kind of era, uh, it was not it did not seem like they were interested in playing a game of gotcha with grantees. Like they really were trying to encourage good faith compliance while also having some sort of mechanism to ensure that people really paid attention and treated it as a real rule. But Carly, I'll hand it over to you and maybe you can say a bit more.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. I mean, I really do think that, historically agencies, want to see people succeed in these policies and, try to um, help folks if possible in doing that. And so I do expect that agencies are tracking compliance. And as they say in the policies, it could be a factor in future award decisions. And DOE has specifically said that they're using this fiscal year to act kind of as a transition year so that they can make progress towards that zero embargo. And so, I hope that other agencies might kind of take that same approach of making progress and trying to kind of hit that zero embargo, but understanding that, it is a bit of a culture shift, even if, the policy was still to submit upon acceptance, it's still kind of shifting the expectations a little bit. I also think, and this was brought up, really appreciated by someone else in another call. I think there are still some open questions about how accurately agencies may be able to track that immediate compliance, depending on how they are monitoring compliance, because some of the tools that they use might have a lag for indexing articles. And so if there's a lag, it might be challenging to determine kind of that immediate tracking. So the next question that came in was, will there be clarification on reasonable publication costs? When I was still in government, agencies really had been kind of monitoring publication costs and changes with them. And we were having kind of interagency conversations about this to determine If there was anything that we could do across the government to either define reasonable publication costs or at least have similar expectations. And right now, most agencies have kind of been deferring to the grant application peer review process. So, when you put in a budget proposal, if there are publication fees within that, that often will go through the peer review process. And so if something seemed unreasonable, that could be a part of the discussion there. But of course, with NIH announcing the cap of allowable publication fees, and it's still open how they will actually apply that, and I think encourage folks to respond to the RFI. But so far, we have not seen other agencies following along, but that's something that we will obviously be tracking very closely. Also received a question about how researchers should consider these requirements as they're developing grant proposals. And so kind of hit on that a little bit, when applying for funding, as much as possible, try to consider where they might want to publish and understand potential fees that would come along with that. And also, if there are fees, potentially consider other alternative publishers where they do allow for compliance and deposit with zero embargo policies. But if there are any fees, include those in funding proposals. Also, since deposit is an organizational responsibility, are there universities or libraries depositing for the authors or planning to do so? I am aware that in the past there had been some projects to kind of explore this, but as far as I know, I don't believe any were fully implemented. So I'm not aware of this currently in practice, but would love to hear from folks if this is something that your organization is doing or planning to do. Also asked, what role, if any, do institutional repositories play with these requirements? So, as we discussed, the policies really are focused on repositories, but they are agency repositories and depositing there. So, depending on if you have, institutional policies or if folks are depositing in institutional repositories, that could potentially help with compliance because you are kind of collecting that, but of course would still need deposit in agency repositories. But this is an area that SPARC has been working on for a long time, and will continue to push for IR deposit as a compliance pathway, and work to support institutional repositories through a number of different mechanisms, including USRN. Also, how can institutions and libraries support campus researchers who are increasingly caught in the middle between federal agency public access policies and publisher requirements? And so, I think this is a really good question, and really would love to kind of hear from you all about how you are supporting this. But there's already, of course, you all are doing a lot of really great work educating researchers on agency policies, publisher policies and fees, and publisher options they might want to consider that don't have fees to comply. And if at all possible, trying to educate others on campus, for example, university administration, about any the challenges being faced with publisher fees, and as much as possible, encourage, reward, and incentive of behavior change. If there are university administrators that are interested in being more involved or having discussions with peers, Helios is a great community to get involved in. And then I think this is the last question we received ahead of time. If the House CJS Appropriations Bill Section 550 passes, what will the impact be? So I did include the specific language if folks are not familiar, but basically in the House Appropriations CJS bill, it does have language in there saying that no funds could be used to implement the memo. I will say that we have seen this language before, but it has not been enacted. So that is something, that SPARC is really advocating for, has sent a letter to the Appropriations Committee, and are really pushing for that. If by some chance it were to pass, I think it is very much an open question because public access is really now kind of in standard agency workflows, in notice of funding opportunities, in scientific and technical information reporting, not just on publications and data, but other research outputs, in annual reporting processes. So I think it would be very difficult for agencies to kind of determine funding that's specifically going to memo implementation that's not kind of wrapped up in their other, just kind of standard operating. So as I mentioned, that was the last question that we had sent in ahead of time. So I think we will jump into the questions that we have received so far.